Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Quincy Adams, and the focus is Russia and peace. The year is 1809. James Madison has just become the fourth President of the United States, and he inherited a bit of a mess, a foreign policy mess. And he knew it all too well, having served as Secretary of State to Thomas Jefferson for the previous 8 years. The problem was Britain and France, and they were at war with each other again, and they kind of put the United States caught in the middle. They were taking it out on American trade, as the United States was trying to continue trade, stay out of the military fight, remain neutral, but that was considered acts of war on behalf of the belligerents, and so both sides were capturing American shipping. They had tried an economic plan, an embargo at the end of Jefferson's term. It didn't work out very well. Madison continued some economic policies, but he also wanted to try to see if he could do something from a negotiation standpoint, and he wanted a new diplomat that he could send to Russia. Tsar Alexander was notionally aligned with Napoleon and France at the time, thought that maybe he could have some influence and get better treatment for American shipping. And so he wanted someone who was an experienced diplomat, maybe someone who'd been to Russia before, and of course John Quincy Adams was at the top of the list. Adams was nominated for the position, and there were only, of course, a couple of problems, as there typically were with some of these new assignments, one of them being the United States Senate. He needed to be confirmed to the role, and Adams had just spent 5 years in the Senate, and they didn't make a lot of friends in the Senate, and so it was a dicey proposition. It took 2 votes before he was finally confirmed. But the bigger problem was probably in the Adams household. Once again, Louisa, his wife, didn't want to go. She didn't want to go halfway across the world to Russia. Again, she wouldn't know anybody there. And then when Adams told her that the older boys, George and John, would be staying in Massachusetts with his parents and not coming with them, only 2-year-old Charles could come, she was completely distraught. But again, she acquiesced, as she always did, in this marriage between Louisa and John Quincy Adams. So they boarded the ship, the Horace, and off they went toward Russia. And the first big question was, would they make it in time for the winter? The captain of the ship actually thought no. He wanted to find a place to ride out the winter because the ice was going to freeze and he didn't want his ship to get stuck. But Adams said he wasn't going to hear of it. You got to keep going forward. And in fact, they made it, but barely before the ice settled in. So it now was an opportunity to establish a relationship with Tsar Alexander, and it turned out in this case the wives had a positive influence. Alexander and his wife Elizabeth had recently lost a child. And now with 2-year-old Charles and Louisa in town, they actually started bonding a bit as a couple. And so that helped ingratiate Adams into the business side of his relationship with Tsar Alexander as well. Certainly, Alexander was an ally of Napoleon at the time, but he was also wary of Napoleon. And he was helpful to the United States, in fact, almost out of the gate, where Adams helped convince him to put pressure on Denmark, which had captured about 50 American shipping vessels, about $5 million in merchandise, and he got the Danes to release this back out into the economy, which was a big win for Adams and the United States. So that ally in that initial establishment of the relationship with Alexander was really off to a good start. Adams occasionally throughout his life picked up hobbies. Bizarre hobbies sometimes, but things that really interested him. In Russia was one of those. This one was on weights and measures. That's right, somewhat arcane, obviously, but this has been something that had been vexing countries to have a standardization for weights and measures because it impacted trade. You wanted to have equal trade for buying what knowing what you're buying, and this had never been established on a global scale. And so Adams took it upon himself as a hobby to learn everything he could about weights and measures and see if he could have an impact on the world economy somewhere down the road. Well, an interesting thing happened along the way as well as John Quincy Adams' parents got involved in this assignment. They kind of decided that their grandchildren, George and John, really needed their parents, and it was time for John Quincy and Louisa and Charles to come home. So Abigail Adams, John Quincy's mother, wrote a letter to the President of the United States, James Madison, and basically said, "I'd like my son to come home." She said it more diplomatically than that, but that's basically what she said. Well, Madison looked at the Adams family and all that they had done for the country, and he basically said, sure, if that's what you guys are looking for, the family needs this, you know what I'll do? I'll nominate John Quincy Adams to a lifetime position on the Supreme Court. That'll make everybody happy, right? Well, it did, except one person. John Quincy Adams. He had no interest in serving on the court. Remember, he didn't like the law. He couldn't stand the thought of sitting in a courtroom all day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And he actually thought he could do a lot more in service to his country as a diplomat. So he declined, much to the despair of his wife and his own parents. Now, Louisa continued to get pregnant. That was a common thing for the Adamses, and she miscarried the first child she carried when she was in Russia, but then she did have a little girl that they named after her mother, Louisa. Unfortunately, little Louisa got sick and died after just over a year, which again was a terribly disheartening event, obviously, to both John Quincy and Louisa Adams. John Quincy said she was precisely at the age when the first dawn of intelligence begins to reward the parent's pains and benefits, when every gesture was a charm, every look delight, every imperfect but improving accent at once. As bad as this was on John Quincy Adams, it was frankly much worse on Louisa. She said, "My heart is buried in my Louisa's grave, and my greatest longing is to be laid beside her. Even the desire of seeing my beloved boys gives way to this cherished hope." Louisa Adams continued to suffer long away from home. Well, in the meantime, things were moving in Europe, including Napoleon's French army was inching toward Russia, and Tsar Alexander basically said his ally Napoleon is going to double-cross him, and he's going to come and attack Russia. So he took the initiative and said, "I'm breaking with Napoleon. We are now at war with France." How did this affect the United States and John Quincy Adams' assignment? Well, initially, it didn't. I mean, the Americans were neutral, and so they still had no dog in the fight. But there were cries for war back in the United States for its own reasons against both Britain and France. All of this happening on a global scale at the same time. The French and the British continued to devastate American shipping, and for the British it was even worse because they did this act called impressment, where they would board American ships, identify people that they, without evidence oftentimes, identify people that they said were really British citizens. They would impress them, which meant kidnap them, and put them into service into the Royal Navy. This was one of the reasons why James Madison, when he finally gave in to the war hawks and agreed, this is a one-sided war as it is already, we need to stand up for our honor and fight back, we are going to ask for a declaration of war, and we're going to go against England. June 1st, 1812, he made that request. Shortly thereafter, Congress granted it. Now, this had more of an impact on John Quincy Adams, in part because Tsar Alexander didn't want the British fighting the Americans. Why? Because he wanted all the British soldiers to fight France, to be his ally and not be distracted with something going off in North America. So Tsar Alexander actually offered to arbitrate the dispute between the British and the Americans, and Quincy Adams forwarded this message back to the administration. They were all excited, sent a couple of commissioners to join Adams for the negotiations in Russia. The only problem was Britain said no. So there would be no arbitration by Tsar Alexander. Well, Alexander had his own victory of sorts pretty soon thereafter. March of 1814, he rode into Paris as the French army and Napoleon were defeated. This, of course, meant trouble for the Americans because now all those British soldiers and sailors that were in Europe fighting Napoleon, a lot of them could come to North America and fight the United States. So it was a little bit of a different ballgame now for the Americans. War of 1812, a lot of, not that many battles. They were kind of few and far between, nothing really decisive. And, as an ambassador abroad, John Quincy Adams is among those starting to figure out, how do we bring this thing to an end? The key issue, of course, had remained impressment. The Americans were adamant that it be taken off the table by the British, and the British were equally adamant that they would never give up the practice. But Adams believed the Americans should withdraw this requirement. Why? Because Britain was no longer at war with France or anybody else in Europe. They didn't need impressment anymore. And so let them keep face and keep it on their books as their policy if they want. But the practical matter was they weren't going to be impressing Americans anymore. So why should the Americans continue to fight a war to get it off the table if the practice was going to go away? So this was part of his advice that he was giving to the administration back in Washington. And they eventually came to the same conclusion, to take impressment off the table. But they needed their negotiators in place to actually try to strike a deal. And who did they send? Well, it was kind of an all-star cast. Top of the list, the chairman of the commission, John Quincy Adams. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, was on the commission. Albert Gallatin, the Treasury Secretary, and a couple of others all came to Belgium. They settled in Ghent and started these negotiations in the latter portion of 1814 with the British. They went back and forth on impressment for a while. The Americans tried to get the British to take it off the table, but when they wouldn't, that's when they got the official word from the administration: you don't need to insist on impressment being taken away by the British. We'll live with it because we don't think it's going to happen often. See if you can get peace. Well, from there it went pretty quickly. They ended up agreeing to what they called the status quo ante bellum. Basically, we're going back to the way things were before the war. There would be no indemnity, no land swaps. It's a draw. It's almost like nothing ever happened, and we'll settle for peace. And John Quincy Adams helped lead the way to the Treaty of Ghent, signed December 24th, 1814. He wrote a letter to his wife, Louisa, who was still with Charles back in St. Petersburg in Russia. They didn't make the trip to Ghent. He said, "I consider the day on which I signed it the happiest of my life, because it was the day on which I had my share in restoring the peace of the world," the words of John Quincy Adams. So celebration time, and it was also a time to reunite with his wife. Part of the message was, "Louisa, please come. Let's reunite in the western part of Europe, and we'll have the family back together." Well, this started about the most harrowing 40 days of Louisa Adams's life. Not only was it an arduous 2,000-mile journey to get back with her husband, but Napoleon escaped the clutches of the British, and it only lasted 100 days or so. It was right at the time when Louisa was traveling that a lot of Napoleon's followers were manning the roads and ready to kind of rise up to get him back into power. Well, the Russians that were escorting Louisa wanted none of this, and so they actually just got out of there and headed back to Russia. She had to get some other help to continue the journey. But this was not a great place for the wife of an American minister. She actually took the advice of some folks who said, "Look, just play along. Say go Napoleon. Cheer him, cheer his supporters just to get through." And that's kind of what she did. It worked. It was not a fun month and a half for Louisa Adams, but finally she and her husband and son Charles are together again. Adams had one more assignment in Europe. Just like his father after the Revolutionary War and the Treaty of Paris, he became the minister to Great Britain. Same thing for John Quincy Adams after the Treaty of Ghent. He was assigned to be the minister to the court of St. James. Not a lot happened. He was there for a couple of years. There were a little bit of trade agreements, but by and large, it was sort of an uneventful time. But he did have his other boys come over, George and John. The family came back together, and so it was a good time. It just wasn't all that productive, as his career as a foreign minister finally came to an end. At this point, it was actually time for another job, to step up to the nation's highest diplomatic post, Secretary of State. But that's the story for another day. That is John Quincy Adams and Russia and Peace, from the life of John Quincy Adams. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.